Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. We begin the show with confirmation by Bukit Aman that several individuals from AlJazeera will be called up by the police this week for investigation over its documentary titled Locked Up in Malaysia's Lockdown. The Malaysian government has slammed AlJazeera for portraying what it claims is an inaccurate picture of the treatment of undocumented migrants during the MCO period. Now, the police are also planning to call up a Bangladeshi man known as Raihan Kabir, who was involved in the documentary. We don't know yet if authorities have found him. However, yesterday, the Immigration Department issued a circular seeking public information on Raihan. The circular included not only his passport number, but also his last known address. Now, civil society groups have warned that in doing so, it could possibly trigger lynch mob mentality, especially as we've seen an increase in hate speech against foreign workers.
Yeah, Melissa, I mean, he's not just involved. I mean, he was somebody who was interviewed for the thing, who gave testimony about the treatment of a particular individual, his friend in this instance. And for all journalists, when we go to people and ask them to share their stories with us, to reveal something about the world, we expose them. And we expose them in this instance. He was exposed to danger, the danger of being called up by the police. We don't know what actually the police intend to do with him. But we've since heard from the Immigration Department that they are of the view that anybody who casts the country in a negative light, as they define it, is likely to have their status revoked. So even if you are fully documented or you have a valid visa, if you were an academic, does that mean you wouldn't be able to speak critically of this country or its policies? That's
a good point. Does this apply to all foreigners? I also wanted to point out, I'm curious to know whether that is standard practice for the Immigration Department to release such personal information on people that they're seeking public information on. But what has happened is that, I guess, online netizens had picked up this information. In fact, Raihan has been doxxed, as they say, his personal information, his phone number, his Facebook account. All of that has actually gone viral, and they've, a litany of hate speech and derogatory terms have been directed at him. Yeah,
because this was not new. Remember, there was a case also of an individual who apparently was speaking on behalf of the Rohingya community. Again, these are patterns. We see these patterns again and again of individuals now targeted in the crosshairs of groups claiming to be defending the nation against aspersions cast against it, and so on and so forth. Often it doesn't result in very much, but it's a pattern that's set and could be a dangerous one.
Well, you said a little earlier that the Immigration Department is also warning all foreigners not to say anything that could tarnish the image of the country. It got me thinking, because this was also a warning repeated by Bukit Aman. I wonder what that means, this tarnishing the image of the country. Is it, international news organizations that put out critical pieces on Malaysia? Is it an international corruption scandal? Does that tarnish the image of Malaysia? I really want to know what that means in the eyes of the authorities.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, the issue of reputation is a tricky one to wrap one's head around. But of course, if you have power, then you have essentially the power to define what these things mean. But it goes back to the heart of what you're saying, Melissa, which is that are we a society that can accept criticism? Can we accept that whether you're Malaysian or not a Malaysian, that you might have a valid point of view? It might be critical of individuals or corporations or the government of the day. Regardless, these are just points of view, and the strategy is to engage with them. Maybe insist on a right of reply.
Exactly. It's not too late to reply. In fact, a group of 35 civil society organizations and 17 individuals have expressed concern about why the police are investigating AlJazeera as opposed to looking at, the report, what was in the report. Now, I also think it's interesting to contrast the government's response to the AlJazeera documentary to the way Sime Darby is handling its bad press. Liberty Shared, which is a Hong Kong-based anti-trafficking group, it has alleged conditions of forced labour and child labour at Sime Darby plantations. Now, the NGO is petitioning the US to ban imports of palm oil products by Sime Darby plantation, which incidentally is the largest listed palm oil company in the world. Now, Sime Darby's response, I think, was really interesting, because what they said was they were going to look into these serious allegations. If I could read from their statement, quote, "In the spirit of openness, transparency and collaboration, we intend to engage with Liberty Shared to further understand these allegations in detail to enable us to conduct a thorough and immediate investigation and take corrective action as the findings may warrant," end quote. Interesting statement there, Sharaad.
Yeah, again, we have this thing where the messenger is, attacked when they bring bad news, when they suggest that there might be misdeeds and such. The response from a type of mentality, I think, is to say, well, let's defend our reputation first. And so you attack the reputation of the other person or the corporation that's making these allegations or the entity that's making these allegations. You cast aspersions on individuals. You deploy and mobilize others to do the same in order to bolster your position, rather than engage in the substance of what were the allegations that you said were incorrect or misconstrued or framed in a way that exaggerated them, so on and so forth. I think these a point-to-point rebuttal would have been much better as a response to this, because then we all learn. We all would have learned if, in fact, the characterization of the problem. And I actually watched the documentary. Melisa, did you? Because I think it was, well, I don't necessarily think it was the best one, but it was certainly reasonable. And I think there was a lot of food for thought in it.
Well, okay, so I have to say the reason why the Sime Darby plantation news interested me is the response. I'm wondering whether government can learn from corporates in the way their PR has chosen to respond to this. This is what it means to respond to allegations. Now, the palm oil industry has been, dogged by these claims of a rampant, land clearing, of poor treatment of its workers. I have to point out 95% of which of workers that work in the plantation industry are foreign workers. So the way Sime Darby Plantation, a corporate, has responded to allegations of labour mistreatment is hopefully the way that I had hoped the government respond to the allegations cast upon them.
One of the things, of course, has been our reputation over the pandemic and the public health crisis. We've done reasonably well. I mean, we're ranked, I think, 30 out of, the nations in the world in terms of safety. And it's a fair ranking. And the question, of course, is, was it all perfect? If it wasn't all perfect, what were the lapses? Where could we have done better?
But nobody's expecting perfection, right? No one is expecting perfection from a country, from a government going through a pandemic for the first time.
Yeah, well, if your self-perception is that you can't take any criticism, then maybe you expect yourself to be perfect or want to be seen to be that way. Okay,
we're going to take a quick break. In just a few minutes, we're going to be discussing why that AlJazeera documentary has sparked so much nationalist vitriol. We'll take a look at the foundations of the rising intolerance towards migrants. Stay tuned to consider this. You're watching Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris. With me is Sharaad Kuttan. Over the last 5 months, Malaysia has seen a dramatic shift in its politics, the unfolding of a public health crisis, and also an economic downturn threatening the livelihoods of millions. Now, has this resulted in a general atmosphere of anxiety that pervades the entire society? And is it driving many of the controversies we've seen in the public realm recently, including the recurring anti-immigrant sentiment? Joining us on the line now to share his thoughts, we have joining us Ahmad Fuad Rahmat, Assistant Professor with the School of Media, Languages and Culture at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Fuad, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Now, do you think that these anxieties, both personal and collective, are driving much of the public discourse in Malaysia today?
Yeah, I think it's definitely tied to the recent events. COVID actually ended up fostering a kind of nationalism that we hadn't seen in a while, where everybody reinforced their common identity as Malaysians and were willing to just work through the lockdown and play their part. And that was surprising even for most Malaysians that they could kind of pull through for 2 to 3 months. So I think there's this collective spirit that managed to make us all survive the pandemic. But that, of course, leads to a lot of other issues that comes with nationalism, like, othering, chauvinism, and the like. So, yeah, it's both part of the same coin.
Fuad, do you think that the language we use as critics of those who are, we call anti-immigrant or anti-refugee, we use the word xenophobic or xenophobia to describe the phenomenon. Is that too strong a word? I mean, are we really capturing in that word the true ground sentiments of a lot of Malaysians who feel that something's gone wrong with the situation of migrants in this country?
I think the word xenophobia definitely applies to the more, I guess, extreme strands who hold that opinion, So some of the more conservative groups do hold rather unreasonable opinions about how to handle migrant workers and refugees. But I think for the most part, Malaysians are just not really aware of the issue, and they're taking a very base knee-jerk position towards it. This is not to excuse them. Of course, that's inexcusable, but it's mild enough for us to kind of engage and try to kind of listen to where they're coming from and, have counter arguments and sort of discuss it through.
Right.
So while I think it's there, it's pervasive, I don't necessarily think that it's hopeless or it's going to snowball to something worse quite yet.
Okay, so you say, Fuad, it's not as pervasive as it seems to be, but sometimes, especially on social media, these types of conversations are amplified. I'm wondering, just, in your opinion, how much of these anxieties or the xenophobia, how much of that is organic versus, say, manufactured?
I think it's a confluence of various factors. I think some people have taken the opportunity to kind of build on those anxieties given the political uncertainties that are going on right now. We have a Malay Muslim majority government, and they depend on pandering to certain ethno-nationalist and chauvinist sentiments to legitimize their position, and I think there are echoes and ripples to that, and people are unfortunately exposed to that. So I think it's a bit of both. I think there are genuine organic anxieties about just being uncertain about the future, and also certain political elements fanning the flames.
I just want to try and wrap my head around this. Migrants, documented or otherwise, has in recent memory always been an integral component of Malaysian life, especially part of our economy. I'm wondering, Fuad, when did we go from accepting to xenophobic?
I think this year, I think a lot of the apprehensions around, sudden turn of events, political uncertainties, economic difficulties, the pandemic, just led to migrant workers becoming, unfortunately, easy scapegoats. We look for, easy diagnosis of the problems, and these are generally communities that most Malaysians will not really encounter. In a genuine sense, beyond sort of like cost-benefit work arrangements and stuff like that. So there's just a lot of ignorance about what migrant workers go through, their voicelessness, their precariousness, their general vulnerabilities. So I think it's just socially a climate wherein people are looking for villains, and unfortunately, given that, COVID has fostered a certain very base nationalism, migrant workers have become those others, the communities that are so singled out as easy villains, as it were.
What about other communities? We've had other cycles of anti-migrant, if you like, feelings. There was this whole issue around Chinese, nationals buying properties in Johor, and there was a whole debate around whether Johor would be swamped with Chinese nationals, and so on and so forth. Do you think any of this might become part of a political program that would turn Malaysia away from globalization, will turn inwards and see Malaysia as needing to raise its, ramparts against, the barbarians from around the world who are here to either exploit us or do something bad to us? I mean, is that a likely route for this politics to go?
Well, the key word in your question there is, whether all of this will amount to a political program, right? No, it won't, because, like Melisa said, we're too dependent on migrant labor to kind of allow us the affordable lifestyles that we're living. I know for a lot of people it's not becoming more affordable because the economy is tough, but it will be worse when the cost of labor goes up. And what sustains the cost of labor to at least a reasonable, familiar standard is the fact that we do depend on migrant workers. That's just not going to change. We're one of the biggest net importers of labor in the world. So that just can't change overnight. We cannot just stop relying on trade partners as big as China. What these things do is just generate and snowball anxieties. I think people will be more likely to, stick to more cultural and traditionalist kinds of politics as a result. They're not going to go the more liberal route, for example. But this is a statement of the broader transitions that the world is going through, right? So the grand narrative right now is that the West is falling apart, and Asia is somehow, rather East Asia, Southeast Asia, is somehow managing to stay afloat, right? So while that's sort of interesting, it's not really leading to a familiar picture of the world. In fact, we don't really know what the world is going to look like. And I think all of this feeds into a lot of these base sentiments, right? This, me against others, my culture against other cultures, local versus foreigners. These are easy binaries for very convenient narratives to kind of pander to base emotions. So this is sort of the cycle we're going through right now.
Well observed, Fuad, and well said. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We appreciate your time and your insights. We're going to take a quick break, but after this we'll continue our discussion about the restriction of debate on the issue of migrants, whether by intolerant societies or by repressive governments. So stay tuned to consider this. Thank you for staying with Sharaad and I on Consider This. International NGO Human Rights Watch today raised concerns that Malaysian authorities have been increasingly responding to criticism of the government by initiating criminal investigations on journalists, activists and even ordinary citizens. Now, there seems to be a steadily narrowing of the boundaries of what can be said without the threat of reprisal. Gayathry Venkataswaran is an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. She joins us now. Good evening, Gayathry. Now, journalists and media organizations have come under increasing pressure recently, and it's not just AlJazeera, but also Tashni Sukumaran, Bu Sulin, Malaysia Kini, and Stephen Gan, and many others. Now, I'm wondering what protections, particularly legal protections, do the media have in this country?
Good evening, and this is really quite a sort of a long-standing issue whereby when you asked about legal protections, in fact, our legal framework is one that is designed far more for the punitive measures that can be meted out rather than actual protection. So while we may have the constitution that says, look, there's protection for freedom of expression, but actually our laws don't provide any form of legal protection. And when we talk about the rights of the media to be able to, it's kind of a canary in the mines, right? Like you're giving signs of something that could be the beginnings of a problem, and a state that is interested in accountability would actually use some of the work of the media to sort of like even tell itself what its priorities ought to be. But what has happened is that often journalists, their editors and the outfits that they work with, the outlets that they work with, are left to their own devices to protect themselves. Because these threats can come from anywhere, right? It can come from the state. It can come from non-state actors as well, who use the legal instruments to target the media. So if you have the resources, you may have lawyers that your company can hire for you to defend you. But then there is nothing in between you producing that report, your organization publishing it, and to the point where you're called up for investigation. There is nothing in between that allows for some kind of dialoguing, checking, sort of debates that can actually even relate to some of the controversies that these reports may be bringing on. So there's really no legal protection per se. In fact, what we have, and I think you all are aware as well, that every time that there is a piece of report that's done, you know what is the, or I wouldn't say what is, but what are the sort of Damocles that tend to hang over your shoulder in terms of the laws that can be used.
Gayathry, during the Pakatan Harapan administration, were there any attempts, successful attempts, to change the balance and reframe the way in which the media works and in fact, institute protections for the media?
So in terms of legal, a protection that is legally constructed, no. The only measure we saw was, of course, a repeal of the Anti-Fake News Act, which was definitely problematic. So it sort of removed one of the potential uses of the laws. But to say that during that time there were concrete measures that would then turn around some of the existing structures to say, okay, now we will have a much more guaranteed protections for the media in doing their work, the answer is no. But there were definitely initiatives. So, for example, the discussions about the Media Council would take some of these ongoing issues away from the monopoly of the state to deal with and give it to a much more independent body and say, okay, what are the complaints here? What are the issues in terms of ethical conduct or professional conduct? And allow for a much more, I would say, industry and civil society-led, multi-stakeholder-led process to discuss, rather than leaving it entirely in the hands of the state. So the discussions began. There was interest in earnest, I would say, with the Media Council. But without the removal of the laws, that wouldn't have also been a successful attempt, I would say.
You know, we've seen statements from civil society NGOs and human rights groups, asking the government to cease these actions. But I'm just wondering, Gaya, is there anything that could dampen the government's zeal in using this strategy?
Interesting. Okay. So I would first say I think statements are important, even though they are only statements, but statements are an expression of a position, a statement of solidarity, a statement to raise the public awareness over these issues, and also to actually introduce some of the principles, right? I mean, why are we defending the journalists? Why are we defending the media outlets? There is actually a basis for this, and we should get as many people to understand that at the same time. But look, I think at several moments in our history, we have seen this kind of overzealousness. You asked about the zeal, but there's an overzealousness in terms of how to sort of keep control of the narrative. And where there are attempts to chip at that narrative, then, there's a certain sense of insecurity. Now, what is this government afraid of? What are the institutions afraid of? What do they desire in terms of what the political situation is about? I mean, we can make a lot of speculations about that. But I think that, if they are unable to see the value of having a free and independent media, the value of having the freedom of expression, it is counterproductive for the sustainability of the state. It is counterproductive for a vibrant and pluralistic society, right? I mean, you cannot suppress this.
Can I ask you, do you think Malaysians, ordinary Malaysians, want that either? I mean, do they want to see a vibrant society, or, are they happy with the government's monopoly on information?
Well, I mean, it's hard to tell because, we are talking about a society that is both fragmented and also, we can say divisive in some points. But at the same time, you have segments of society that aspire for these values. So it is not that we have one set of values only. And even if we say that there are those in society who agree with the position of the state, Now, you can agree with many things, whether they are right or they are wrong. We have to have a much higher standard in terms of what is fair for everyone, what actually contributes towards the development of society as well. You may not like it, you may not like somebody's view, but some of these protections need to be in place, because it's okay if you don't agree or if you don't like, but there's no reason to put someone behind bars. We need to agree on some of this quite basic standards, really, you know. So we're not asking for the moon and the sun and whatever. We are actually talking about some very, very fundamental rights at the heart of it.
Well, Gaya, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. It's always a pleasure talking to you. That's all the time we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris.
And I'm Sharaad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching. Good night, folks.